Okay. Uh, Let me start the lecture. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Topic of today's lecture is clinical features, diagnosis, and management of hyperparathyroidism and hypoparathyroidism. So first, I'm going to start with the hyperparathyroidism. So this is a famous figure you can see. Bones, stones, groans, and psychic moans, and this is all because of hypercalcemia. The sign and symptoms of hypercalcemia. नहीं हो रही अच्छा और आवाज आ रही है उनको सही है आवाज तो सही है अब सुनाई दे रहा ओके so the topic is clinical feature diagnosis management of hyperparathyroidism and hypoparathyroidism and I was explaining that this is a famous picture of the symptomatology of and signs of hypercalcemia. So patient presents with bone pains and can have renal stones and since high calcium is causing peptic ulcer, constipation, other abdominal symptoms, GI related symptoms. So there can be pains and groans, and then hypercalcemia is also affecting the CNS. This patient can present with psychic symptoms, confusion, depression, and so on. So parathyroid gland is basically not, there are 4 parathyroid glands which are situated on the back side of the thyroid gland. Normally, the size of the gland is 5 into 4 into 2 millimeter, and it weighs roughly 35 to 50 milligram each. Color is from light yellow to reddish brown. Shape is oval, but some of them can be bean shaped or spherical in shape. And 84% of the people have 4 glands. 2 of them lie in the superior pole of the thyroid lobes, and 2 of them lie in the inferior poles. But sometimes there can be extra parathyroid glands, then it is called supernumerary in 13%. And sometimes there can be less number of parathyroid glands, so only 3 glands is found in some people, which is very rare. So the main function of parathyroid hormone is calcium regulation. As you can see here in the figure, that how it is it is responsible for increase in calcium reabsorption from the gut, along with vitamin D hydroxylation in the kidneys, which again help in calcium reabsorption from the intestines. And then that calcium is utilized in the bones and utilized in other parts of the body, other symptom, other different functions in the body which it has. And then to maintain the serum calcium in the blood in the homeostasis, the parathyroid hormone plays its role. So it is a major hormone modulating calcium and phosphate homeostasis and maintains the concentration of calcium within a narrow range. Because the range is 8.5 to 10 in most of the laboratories. So it is a very narrow range. Stimulation of renal tubular calcium reabsorption. It is through this mechanism that it maintains that range. Through bone resorption, so it acts on bones, again to maintain the serum calcium range in the normal range. And then hydroxylation of vitamin D, which in the renal tubular cells, which in turn stimulate intestinal calcium absorption. So you see, these 3 are the main mechanisms through which parathyroid hormone is maintaining the serum calcium within a narrow range in the blood. PTH secretion regulated by ionized calcium acting via sensitive calcium sensing receptor and on the surface of the parathyroid cell. So how the PTH itself is regulated is through the ionized calcium, which acts on the CASR, which is present on the surface of the parathyroid glands. This is the figure of whole human PTH. So you can see it is a long polypeptide chain, and which is composed of several amino acids. Almost 81 to 84 is the count, and the most active region of this this whole polypeptide is the last 5 to 6 amino acids, which are important. But the function of the whole polypeptide is important for its regulation, for its functioning, secretion, and so on. Intact PTH is rapidly cleared through uptake principally by the liver and kidney, where it is fragmented into carboxy and N terminals, and then they are cleared by the kidney. So intact PTH has a very small plasma half-life, just 2 to 4 minutes, whereas the C-terminal fragments can have a long half-life, sometimes 5 to 10 times. That means they can be found in hours, in couple of hours maybe. But the intact PTH is very small, has a very small half-life. So as a result, the circulating PTH in normal subject comprises intact PTH, which is present about, which comprises about 5 to 30% of the total PTH, and then the C terminal, which comprises 70 to 95%. And the N terminal, it is composed of a very small percentage. Now, these are the three main hormones which are responsible for calcium homeostasis in the blood. I've already explained how PTH is acting on the bones, where it supposed osteoclast resorption, and how it acts on the gut, where it increases calcium in the blood through calcitriol, that is activated vitamin D, and it acts on the kidney, again helping the calcium reabsorption from the renal cells, phosphate excretion, and thirdly the activation of the 1-alpha hydroxylation of the vitamin D, which is present in the blood and needs activation to be converted into calcitriol ultimately. So these are the three ways how PTH is acting, and the main purpose of this PTH hormone is to increase the calcium in the blood, decrease the phosphate level in the blood, and thus maintain the homeostasis. Now let's come on to the vitamin D and then calcitonin. Now vitamin D is also, a steroid hormone, you can say, because it is the basic structure is composed of a steroid core, and it increases calcium in the blood and increases phosphate level in the blood as well. It effects on bone is that it does not directly has any effect on bone as such, but it supports the osteoblasts for functioning. The function of the osteoblast, as you may all know, that is to maintain the bone architecture. So it helps in getting calcium and phosphate deposition in the bone. On the other hand, the GI, the intestines, it basically helps in calcium and phosphate absorption. On the kidney, it does not have any direct effect. However, its main activation takes place in the kidney under the effect of PTH. Coming to the calcitonin, calcitonin acts opposite to the PTH with respect to calcium. It decreases blood calcium. However, it also decreases blood phosphate levels as well. So main function is to increase the calcium in the blood. So how does it act? It inhibits osteoclast resorption in the bone, which is opposite to the PTH action. In this way, the calcium in the blood is not increased, it remains in the bones, and the calcium level is lowered. Its effect on the GI is not as such any significant. However, it helps in promoting calcium and phosphate excretion in the kidney. So you see, the main function of calcitonin is to lower the serum calcium levels, whereas the main function of the PTH is to increase or maintain the higher level of calcium level in the blood. When these two hormones are working in balance with each other, the calcium levels are maintained in the normal range. Now let's see about the parathyroid gland. I wish I could play this video. Okay, let's, I think, just move on, I think. Okay, it is not able to. Okay, let it be. वीडियो नहीं चल रही है, मैंने एक YouTube की लिंक से डाली हुई है, इसमें है ये रही, ये है, लेकिन ये चल नहीं रही है. हाँ बस चलो, छोड़, खैर है. Okay, let's move on. So the clinical features of hyperparathyroidism: the mnemonic stones, bones, abdominal moans, and psychic groans. This describes the constellation of symptoms and signs of hypercalcemia. I've already explained in my first slide. But what is actually happening? See the terms here, and you must, get yourself familiarized with these terms, because then you will be exposed to clinical practices. Then there you have to be, aware with these terms. So in renal, that means in the kidney, the effect of hypercalcemia leads to polyuria, that is excessive urination, polydipsia, excessive thirst. And when you have a lot of water loss through these mechanisms, then this leads to dehydration. And when the body is dehydrated, it is more prone to the risk for kidney stones, because there is a high calcium level in the blood. In the skeletal system, most causes of hypercalcemia are associated with increased bone resorption, and thus that leads to risk of fracture, because all of the calcium is getting into the blood, leaving the bones, empty of calcium really. The GI tract, there is anorexia, constipation, nausea, and vomiting. Because as I told you, calcium has its effect on the intestinal mucosa, gut mucosa. Through that, it is acting on several, neurotransmitters which have effect with the brain. So that leads to nausea, vomiting, and slowing of the gut peristalsis leads to constipation. So that's how hypercalcemia is affecting on in the GI tract. In the CNS, there is altered behavior, lethargy, depression, decreased alertness, confusion and temptation, and finally coma. So you see very high calcium of 14 and 15 is actually a hypercalcemic crisis and an emergency. Then comes this cardiovascular effect on the cardiovascular system. This leads to short QT interval, variable degrees of heart blocks. It cause and exacerbate hypertension as well. In the eyes, it can lead to pruritus, soreness of eyes, and soreness of eyes because of band keratopathy. Band keratopathy means the cornea of the eyes are affected with high calcium level, and that leads to pain, because you see in our eyes, cornea is very sensitive and it has pain receptors. So anything getting disturbed on the cornea leads to pain actually. Now, how do you investigate a case of hypercalcemia to lead to a diagnosis of, for example, hyperparathyroidism, because this is the topic of hyperparathyroidism? First of all, you have to confirm that this is really hypercalcemia or not. So you have to see serum calcium once, not only once, but twice or thrice. You have to get it repeated, and make sure you have adjusted it for the albumin level, because calcium is a lot of bind to albumin and then globulins and pre-albumin. These are the other proteins in the blood which bind calcium. So the actual true serum calcium does not give you actual ionized calcium picture. Ionized calcium is the one which is not bound to these proteins and is actually functional at the tissue level. And if that is sufficient, then the serum calcium can be misleading, because serum calcium reflects the whole calcium in the blood, the one which is bound to the proteins and the one which is not. So you must confirm whether this is really hypercalcemia or not. Hypercalcemia is any calcium level above the range. So if our range is 10, 10.5, say for example, and it is coming out to be 10.6 or even 11, then that is a high calcium, okay? Then determine the mechanism. Once you've confirmed that this is high calcium, then you have to understand whether it is a PTH dependent hypercalcemia or it is a non-PTH dependent. So you need to know the PTH level, that is the parathyroid hormone levels, right? So check that and then look for the reason why the parathyroid hormone is raised. You have to further confirm it with doing the urinary calcium to determine the calcium creatinine excretion ratio, determine end organ damage by doing the 24-hour urinary calcium, renal tract ultrasound, but to see whether there is calculi or nephrocalcinosis, skeletal radiographs to see whether lateral thoracolumbar spine and the hands to see the typical findings of hypercalcemia due to hyperparathyroidism. Then bone mineral density. The BMD means bone mineral density by a DEXA scan. That is a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. Okay, these are far advanced and sophisticated kind of investigation which you have to perform in the case of hyperparathyroidism. When you have confirmed that this is a hyperparathyroidism, then you have to perform these last two investigations. The one is the urinary calcium creatinine ratio, and the other is the end organ damage, because there you have to decide about final diagnosis. as well as you have to see if end organ damage has occurred, then you have to plan your management accordingly. And if you're not sure that this is PTH dependent, that is not hyperparathyroidism, then you may see if there are other causes of hypercalcemia, you must exclude them. Look for chest X-ray, full blood count, ESR, because there can be tuberculosis or sarcoidosis, which can be responsible for hypercalcemia again. Look for the biochemical profile, renal and liver function. Sometimes there are malignancies of the kidney and liver, which can cause paraneoplastic hypercalcemia. And there can be hypercalcemia because of the PTH related protein, which is produced from these tumors. And they are kind of, extra malignant, extra malignant manifestations of cancer. So you call them paraneoplastic manifestations, okay? And or sometimes there can be renal failure, which is of the tertiary, in which advanced renal failure, where you get a tertiary hyperparathyroidism. The parathyroid gland become autonomous, dealing with the kidney problem, and they keep on, emptying the bones from the calcium, and then also you get this hypercalcemia. Then thyroid function test, because in thyrotoxicosis, again, you get hypercalcemia because every metabolism, all steps of metabolism, all parts of metabolism are hyperfunctioning. There is a lot of basal metabolic rate, which is increased. Then bone turnover is increased. That's why hyperparathyroidism is hyperthyroidism, that is thyrotoxicosis itself, is causing hypercalcemia. Then vitamin D. If someone has been taking a lot of vitamin D, sometimes there is a prescription which has been taken for years and years, months and months and years, then so much vitamin D can also cause a lot of hypercalcemia, a lot of calcium in the blood. We call it vitamin toxicosis, vitamin D toxicosis, okay? Then plasma and urine protein electrophoresis. This is just to, exclude myeloma. And multiple myeloma is one of the hematological malignancies where plasma cells are producing abnormal proteins. Okay, and then it is also eroding the bone marrow. It is occupying the bone marrow, replacing the bone actually, and destroying it actually. And that can lead to hypercalcemia in the blood. Moreover, it may be associated with, again, that paraneoplastic PTHRP release. PTHRP, that means PTH related protein, related peptide, and that can be producing a paraneoplastic hypercalcemia. Or you call it hypercalcemia of malignancy. And finally, serum cortisol should be checked and even confirmed with short synectin test to exclude the Addison's disease. Addison's disease is adrenal insufficiency, and in that also you get a high calcium level. The exact mechanism is not known, but if that is present, that can be the reason of high calcium in the blood. So you see, you have to do all these investigations on individual basis. You don't have to do them on every patient of hypercalcemia. Sometimes the clinical picture is very obvious. Then you may exclude the other steps. For example, someone is suffering from thyrotoxicosis, then why would you perform protein and plasma and urine protein electrophoresis to check for multiple myeloma? Or someone is having tuberculosis, then why would you consider kidney failure and so on? So you have to be very skeptical and decide these investigations on individual basis. Primary hyperparathyroidism, now coming on to the types of hyperparathyroidism. Primary. In primary, there is inappropriate secretion of PTH from the parathyroid glands. It may be present up to 1 in 500 of the general population, and predominantly it is a disease of postmenopausal females, but it can be found in both sexes. And 75 to 80% are the cases of parathyroid adenomas. 20% are diffuse hyperplasia of all parathyroid glands, and only less than 1% is parathyroid carcinoma, something which is very rare, okay? And if this is a parathyroid adenoma or hyperplasia, then it can be sporadic, it can be inherited. Sporadic means it can occur to anyone without any risk factor, without any cause, without any genetics in the family. But in inherited, it can be associated with syndromes like isolated familial hyperparathyroidism, MEN 1 and 2, that is multiple endocrine neoplasia 1 and 2. And then there is a hyperparathyroidism, short humor syndrome. So this is the X-ray picture of a hand where hypercalcemia, because of hyperparathyroidism, primary hyperparathyroidism, has caused dramatic remodeling of the bone. Okay, there's a high bone turnover going on in the third metacarpal bone, which because of which it has widened, and there's endosteal, subperiosteal, trabecular resorption is almost gone. Right. Again, there are empty spaces in other phalanges, especially on the radial side. So the important radiological finding which we get in hyperparathyroidism is the osteoporosis. This is the most common. Okay, it affects predominantly peripheral cortical bones, like the hands, the lower limbs, the feet. But it's otherwise mostly the more postmenopausal osteoporosis, we get axial or central bone involved. That is the spinal, the vertebral column, the hip bone, the femurs, the neck of femurs, and so on. But in hyperparathyroidism, the osteoporosis is mostly peripheral. Other radiographic changes which are uncommon include subperiosteal resorption, abnormal skull walls, eroded lamina dura, and bone cysts. So because of resorption of the bone, the whole architecture of the bony structure is gone, is getting eroded, is getting shed off. Then osteitis fibrosa cystica. This is a rare condition. It is actually brown tumor, or again, you see this type of picture, which you see in the hand here, in the third metacarpal, is a kind of osteitis fibrosa cystica, because here the resorbed bone is now getting replaced from fibrosis or fibrous tissue, which becomes autonomous, grow on itself, and becomes a tumor. Usually this condition is found in a very advanced kind of hyperparathyroidism, like tertiary hyperparathyroidism. In kidneys, there can be renal calculi, nephrocalcinosis, and finally renal failure, renal kidney function failure. And in the joints, there can be chondrocalcinosis, the pseudo-gout, because the cartilage of the joint space is eroded and destroyed. There can be, in the pancreas, there can be pancreatitis because of hypercalcemia. Now, how do you diagnose primary hyperparathyroidism? I've already explained that you have to check for calcium, check the renal functions, U and E. See if the patient is not taking the drugs which can cause hypercalcemia, like lithium and thiazide diuretic. And the PTH itself has to be more than 30, which is like 20%. Patients can have normal PTH as well, but the PTH is in the upper part of the normal range. And the range of PTH in our labs is mostly, the upper limit is 67, or sometimes it is 87 in certain labs. So even in that range, in that level, if it is more than 30, then you have to think about that patient can have a normal, hyperparathyroidism, but PTH is now getting in the upper part of the normal range. The urinary calcium has to be more than 100 milligram per day. And then you have to exclude underlying condition, as I explained. You have to check for genetic abnormalities like MEN1 and 2 syndromes and familial hyperparathyroidism. You have to screen the family members with the calcium. So this is usually sought in patients presenting with primary hyperparathyroidism, and they have a family history in which one or more than one first-degree relative is affected with hyperparathyroidism, or someone has developed hyperparathyroidism at a very young age, that is less than 40 years. If a patient is having these 2 points in their history, then you have to, suspect genetic cause, and then, look for genes which are involved in MEN1 and 2, as well as familial hyperparathyroidism. Now, coming to the treatment. Treatment is mainly, the mainstay of the treatment is surgery. Sometimes some conditions are there where you have to go for observation, and then medical management. So this is a table which shows how the guidelines have evolved, where you have to take a step that now this is the point where surgery is indicated. So if I just skip down to this 2013 recommendation here, it says that when the calcium level is more than 1 milligram per deciliter above the upper limit of normal, then that is an indication for surgery. Surgery means parathyroidectomy. Okay, and if the bone mineral density shows t-score of less than -2.5 at lumbar spine, total hip, or distal 1/3, or the vertebral fracture is observed by X-ray, CT, MRI, the kidney function shows creatinine clearance of less than 60, the 24-hour urinary calcium is more than 400, because that is increasing the stone risk, okay, by biochemical risk profile. Or if there is already a stone, that is nephrolithiasis or nephrocalcinosis in the kidneys by doing ultrasound or X-ray, whatever, then these are the indications of surgery, because these indicate what? End organ damage, right? This I have explained you earlier. Then doing a bone scan, doing the kidney function analysis and everything for stones, and looking for fractures. These are the end organ damages. These indicate end organ damages, and then you have to plan for surgery. And then if a patient has age less than 50 years, that is an independent indication for surgery, because a patient who is young and has a hypercalcemia, you cannot observe that patient for further 10, 20 years or 30 years for his or her lifespan, because follow up and then maintaining that observation is quite difficult in such patient groups. Now, in surgery, if there is a parathyroid adenoma, remove the affected gland, often doing by minimally invasive surgery. There's a small cut which is performed, not the whole neck is operated, and only the adenoma, the gland which has developed into adenoma, will be removed. Rest will be preserved. However, in case of hyperplasia, because all 4 glands are hyperplastic and all of them are involved in producing higher PTH levels, then partial parathyroidectomy is performed, which is usually removal of 3.5 of the parathyroid glands, and the remaining half gland, which is reserved, is then reimplanted into more accessible site, that is mostly in the forearm. Because if, for example, that hyperplastic half gland also produce high calcium and high PTH and high calcium, then removing that half gland from the forearm will be easier. Now, in surgery, how do you proceed? Basically, you have to localize the parathyroid glands, right? Which one of them is abnormal? So this localization step is only performed as a part of a preoperative assessment, and is not indicated in the routine initial diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism. You have to, do it only when you are deciding our surgery. So localization is performed by doing 2 separate imaging techniques. One is ultrasound and the other is a SESTIM-EV technetium-99 scan. The sensitivity of these 2 scans together is higher than doing either of them alone. Like, for example, someone comes to you with an ultrasound and shows that is a parathyroid adenoma, or may show normal scan, then that is not sensitive enough to exclude that there is a parathyroid adenoma or not. However, if you perform the 2 scans together, 2 imaging techniques together, that will be more sensitive. So order them together whenever you suspect hyperparathyroidism and you want to proceed for surgery. Otherwise, if the scans are not helpful, they're not telling you where the glands are, then open bilateral neck exploration by an experienced surgeon is recommended. After failed neck exploration, other localizing techniques are thallium technetium subtraction scanning, which is less sensitive, and CT scan. These are, finer and more sophisticated type of investigations, not performed everywhere, and you have to take a decision whether you have to do them or not. Sometimes you have to discuss with a multidisciplinary team members, which involve the ENT surgeon, the nuclear physicians, and then they can guide you that, okay, let's move on to these sensitive scans. Angiography with selective venous sampling may be employed in difficult cases, but should be confined to specialist centers with experience in this technique. So this is a SESTIM-EV scan. This is a picture of SESTIM-EV scan, which is quite specific for and sensitive for parathyroid localization. You can see in the first figure that the arrow shows a dark rounded area here. The dye which was taken up by the parathyroid gland is retained even after 120 minutes. So left lower parathyroid adenoma has been diagnosed here. Whereas here it is the gland is highlighted down in the mediastinum. So this is an ectopic position of parathyroid gland, which is also an adenoma. So sometimes it is not found behind the thyroid, rather it has gone further down into the mediastinum. So these, you see, this is a track of the branchial arches where these parathyroid glands, ultimately travel down to settle into their final position. Sometimes the track is moving consistently beyond their final position, and then in that cases you can find ectopic position of the parathyroid glands. Okay. A little bit about the complications of parathyroidectomy, which you should know. Number one is mechanical, and the number two is metabolic. Mechanical because, of course, in the area where parathyroid glands are situated is quite sensitive. It's in the neck. There are large blood vessels, trachea, esophagus, which can get damage if surgery is really nasty one. And then you have vocal cords, which can be affected. Voice can become hoarse or can be gone altogether, and can be permanent, especially if surgeries are performed repeatedly, because they are very sensitive structures closely passing through these parathyroid glands, the vocal cord nerve, the recurrent laryngeal nerve that I'm talking about. So these are the mechanical complications. Other one is tracheal compression from blood, the hematoma. And then metabolic complication, obviously, when you are removing the parathyroid gland, you are removing the PTH from the blood. And PTH, which is a very short half-life, is so active to maintain the calcium in the narrow range. When it is gone, obviously the calcium will go down immediately. And the patient can experience hypocalcemia, which can be transient, which can be severe and permanent. So you have to be skeptical and thoughtful and prepare for that. Transient is due to suppression of the remaining glands, may sometimes require oral therapy with calcium and vitamin D metabolites. So suppression of the remaining gland means if there was an adenoma which was hyperfunctioning, the rest of the glands have gone silent, right? So they are suppressed. But once the adenoma is removed, they are not yet, activated. The remaining glands are not yet, वो अभी तक जागे नहीं हैं जैसे, and then that's the reason they are not able to produce PTH enough to maintain the calcium in the normal range. So for that brief period, transient period, calcium in the oral form and vitamin D has to be given. Then coming to the severe form of hypercalcemia, usually that is due to hungry bones, and hungry bones I'm going to explain later. It is a rare condition. Treatment is with activated vitamin D and oral calcium for several weeks. It occurs in patients with pre-existing bone disease, and you can minimize the risk by pre-treatment of any vitamin D deficiency for several weeks before stepping up for surgery. So let me explain what is hungry bones. Basically, when there is a higher PTH in the blood, it is causing bone resorption, right? So bones are empty of the calcium. And once you remove the PTH from the blood, all the calcium which was present in the blood because of high PTH now go immediately into the bones, because bones were empty and they are hungry. So they are waiting for the calcium to be filled in. And since all the calcium from the blood goes into the bones, so what happens? There is hypocalcemia, severe hypocalcemia. Now to prevent that, they say is that treat the patient before the surgery. And for that, you need an assessment. You have to check for the bones, whether they are affected by hyperparathyroidism and how much they are affected, how much bone disease is there, endocrine damage is there, and check for any vitamin D deficiency, replace that adequately, but not the calcium, only vitamin D, okay? Once these things have been optimized, then the hungry bone syndrome will not happen. So what are the symptoms of hypercalcemia that you have to look after the surgery? And basically they are related to neuromuscular irritability. You can see here, there is fatigue, there is tingling sensation in the body, there may be tooth decay, memory loss, confusion, depression. However, the neuromuscular symptoms which are more of serious effect or more of clinical significance is perioral paresthesia. There is numbness around the oral cavity, Schwastic sign and Trousseau sign, tetany, laryngospasm, bronchospasm, seizures, prolonged QT interval on ECG, extrapyramidal movement disorders, and delirium. So the laryngospasm and bronchospasm as well as tetany are hypocalcemic emergencies. Patient lands in the emergency, patient has to be intubated sometimes, a tracheostomy has to be done. Whereas these Schwastic sign, Truser sign are in the moderate range of hypocalcemia, when you can pick the early sign of hypocalcemia and treat the patient. Again, this is a video, I hope it works, but it's not working. It's showing what is the Schwastic sign. Basically, you have to tap on the facial nerve, which is passing through this zygomatic arch here along the tragus of the ear. Once you tap, there will be twitching or movement of the facial muscles from that side, and that is a positive Schwastic sign. Okay, it's not really working. And this is a Trousseau sign. Trousseau sign is when you elevate the blood pressure above like 20 millimeter mercury above the systolic level of the patient, and keep the blood pressure cuff inflated for nearly 2 to 3 minutes. So what happens, the blood flow to the arm, the hand is compromised, and the calcium flow is also compromised. So what happens, there is flexion of the metacarpophalangeal joint here, the index and the third finger, the middle finger, and there is also hyperextension of the metacarpophalangeal joint of the thumb. Okay, this is how carpopedal spasm is actually taking place, and there's also flexion of the wrist. So these are the two important clinical signs which you can perform on the bedside in your clinical rotations if you get a chance to see a case of hypocalcemia. And these are important and can be asked in your exam and viva. Then you have to look for magnesium deficiency, which is also common due to previous hyperparathyroidism, because hyperparathyroidism also causes renal wasting of magnesium. Then you have to correct magnesium deficiency in order to correct hypocalcemia. Chronic magnesium deficiency also impairs the release of PTH and causes functional hypoparathyroidism and hypocalcemia. Okay, because if there is a adenoma and the remaining parathyroid gland have to now function normally, there can be impairment of the normal function because of chronic magnesium deficiency. Now, how would you manage calcium management following total parathyroidectomy? Hypocalcemia is inevitable unless management is instituted. Preemptive treatment is worth considering, so activated vitamin D should be started 1 to 2 microgram per day. This dose may be insufficient but may prevent life-threatening hypocalcemia and is unlikely to cause serious toxicity in the short term. So once you have done a surgery, start immediately on 1-alpha-calcidiol, start the patient on that, wait for the levels of calcium to come from the lab, and then adjust the dose accordingly. For the acute management, when there is a life-threatening hypocalcemia, that is Trousseau sign is positive, there is laryngospasm and seizure, then you have to give IV infusion of calcium gluconate. You have to prepare that, dilute that in normal saline or glucose 5%, and infuse through a large vein over 10 minutes. Monitor the cardiac rhythm simultaneously. You have to repeat it as needed to control the acute emergency. And if that is, that hypocalcemia life-threatening type is still going on, then put the patient on ongoing calcium replacement through an infusion of 1 liter of 5% glucose or normal saline, where you have added 10% of calcium gluconate in sufficient amount through calculation. And that way you can prevent a recurrent hypocalcemia, life-threatening type of hypocalcemia. You have to monitor the calcium 4 to 6 hourly and adjust the rate of infusion accordingly. Also, simultaneously, you should start the patient on vitamin D or oral calcium and oral vitamin D analogs. Now, the second option of treatment of hyperparathyroidism was observation. Usually it is suitable for patients with mild disease with no evidence of any end organ damage. Most such patients have stable disease over many years, and you have to check annual calcium, annual renal function and blood pressure, and every 2 to 3 years you have to go for bone mineral density and renal ultrasound. Any significant deterioration in such parameters will be an indication for surgery, and this is a repetition of the indication for surgery. Coming to the medical management, it is only indicated if the patient is not suitable for surgery. You have to give hormone replacement therapy if a patient is postmenopausal, and it can help in preserving bone mass. And you have to consider the long-term risk and contraindication of hormone replacement therapy before starting it. You can start the patient on bisphosphonate It can also be helpful, in preserving bone mass, but the plasma and urinary calcium will not be really affected. Then finally, the important targeted treatment is calcium sensing receptor agonist, that is cinacalcet. This is given in the dose of 30 milligram twice daily. It reduces serum calcium, but not urinary calcium concentration. It increases the sensitivity of the calcium sensing receptor, and thus it helps in decreasing the PTH secretion right in the parathyroid gland. So it is indicated or licensed for use in patients with severe secondary hyperparathyroidism who are on dialysis, patients with parathyroid carcinoma, patients who have primary hyperparathyroidism but in whom parathyroid surgery is contraindicated or clinically inappropriate. It may also be used for after failed neck exploration. Coming to the tertiary hyperparathyroidism, renal failure is the main cause of hypercalcemia or hypocalcemia. And when it is called as hypercalcemia, it is because of tertiary hyperparathyroidism, and there are many combination of factors which are working behind it. There is decreased calcium clearance and increased bone resorption, as well as increased GI uptake. So it is characterized by high PTH levels, low vitamin D, 125 hydroxy vitamin D, which is a special form of vitamin D, not checked in all laboratories, low calcium and phosphate renal clearance, and dialysis does a relatively poor job at clearance as well. So this is all about hyperparathyroidism. Now I'm going to start the topic of hypoparathyroidism, and I'm going to go a bit fast because we have short of time. So primary hyperparathyroidism is basically there is decreased secretion of PTH. It is opposite of hyperparathyroidism, right? And basically that is because of destruction of the parathyroid glands, either because of an autoimmune condition, autoimmune hyperparathyroidism, or the parathyroid glands have been removed surgically for whatever reasons. Abnormal parathyroid gland development, and that is mostly by birth or by genetics, or there is altered regulation of parathyroid hormone production and secretion. That means there are receptor defects. But the most common cause of hypoparathyroidism is post-surgical. Usually the surgery is performed either in the thyroid, because the thyroid gland disorders are more common and more important, more common than parathyroid gland disorders. And the parathyroid glands are lying behind the thyroid gland. So the thyroid glands are, when thyroid gland surgery is performed, the parathyroid glands are incidentally removed, not intentionally, but incidentally. In that case, you face hypoparathyroidism, which is post-surgical. However, the destruction of the parathyroid gland, if it occurs surgical, then it can be hypoparathyroidism, which is transient due to stunning of the rest of the suppressed glands, as I've told you earlier. However, it can occur in up to 20% of patients after surgery and recovers in days, weeks, or months. There can be manipulation of the blood supply of one or more parathyroid gland during surgery, suppression of the remaining parathyroid tissue by prior hypercalcemia, or there can be hungry bone syndrome. So surgical destruction can be transient through these mechanisms. It can be permanent because it can, in up to 0.8% to 3% of cases, all 4 glands have been removed and patient has become permanently hypoparathyroid. Then autoimmune hypoparathyroidism is an immune-mediated destruction of the parathyroid gland, and this is usually a permanent disease. Then there can be activating antibodies to the calcium sensing receptor that decrease PTH secretion. And these usually this autoimmune hyperparathyroidism it forms a part of a polyglandular autoimmune syndrome type 1, where you can get celiac disease, type 1 diabetes, and there can be mucocutaneous syndrome where the skin and mucous membranes are affected by candidial infections, and they are not easy to treat. Other causes of hyperparathyroidism, which is also primary, include any irradiation to the neck, storage or infiltrative diseases like hemochromatosis, Wilson's disease, or any metastatic cancer. Then abnormal parathyroid gland development, as I told you, can be by birth and can be due to genetic defects, can be X-linked or autosomal recessive disorder, or the parathyroid glands have not developed at all, have not descended to their normal position, have gone destroyed. A condition which is called PTH resistance or pseudo hypoparathyroidism. It presents in childhood. Patient presents with short stature, unable to grow in height. There are This is a group of heterogeneous disorder defined by target organ resistance actually. The PTH is secreting in the normal amount, level, but it is not able to act on its receptor at the tissue level. This is characterized by hypocalcemia, hyperphosphatemia, and the PTH is also elevated because low calcium is giving a feedback that PTH is not there, then PTH is being continuously released. How do you evaluate a case of hypocalcemia? Etiology of hypocalcemia may be obvious from the clinical history once you take a proper history. There can be a family history of hypocalcemia which can suggest genetic cause. Chronic hypocalcememia can be seen in patients with an activating mutation of calcium sensing receptor and pseudohyperparathyroidism. Acquired hyperparathyroidism is most often the result of post-surgical condition or autoimmune damage. Post-surgical hyperparathyroidism can occur after thyroid, parathyroid, or other radical neck surgeries for head and neck cancers. And then autoimmune hyperparathyroidism can occur as an isolated abnormality or can also occur as a common feature of polyglandular syndrome type 1. Now, these are the clinical manifestation of acute and chronic hypocalcemia. I'm not going to go through them. I've already explained them when I was dealing with total thyroidectomy, total parathyroidectomy and hypocalcemia after that. So acute manifestation is all well known now. However, the chronic manifestation includes ectopic calcification, especially in the basal ganglia. So if you get a case of hypocalcemia where you suspecting a genetic condition or hereditary condition, you can order MRI of the brain where you can get basal ganglia calcification or a CT scan of the brain rather. And because basal ganglia are affected, then there can be extrapyramidal signs, Parkinsonism, dementia, subcapsular cataracts because calcium can be deposited there, and abnormal dentation in dry skin. So tetany is defined as a repetitive high frequency discharge after single stimulus. Basically, there is hyperexcitability of peripheral neurons due to hypocalcemia. And I've told you earlier, it can cause perioral numbness, paresthesia, and in the severe form, it can cause tetany, carpopesal spasm, laryngospasm, and so on. Less specific symptoms of fatigue, anxiety, depression. There can be autonomic manifestation like diaphoresis, bronchospasm, and biliary colic. Extrapyramidal features include basal ganglia calcification due to long-standing hyperparathyroidism, and this is all repetition actually. And in the eyes, you can get cataract. In the dental abnormalities, there can be when it is present in the early stages, then can be hypoplasia, failure of tooth eruption, defective enamel, and root formation. Early treatment of hypocalcemia can reverse these changes, but if not, then they can be permanent. In the skin, there can be dryness, puffiness, coarse, brittle hair with patchy alopecia, brittle nails, transverse grooves will be there. And these grooves will, correlate with the severity and chronicity actually. And they are also reversible with with restoration of normal calcemia. Moniliasis is basically candidiasis and is usually a component of polyglandular syndrome type 1. So if there is a condition where you are getting candidiasis along with hypoparathyroidism, then that is a polyglandular you're dealing with. And that is associated with defective cellular immunity, which can persist despite correction of hypocalcemia. You have to give antifungal treatment for a long time. Nail, skin, GI tract can be involved. And although it is refractory to antifungal therapy, but you have to give that treatment for a long time to, treat as much candidiasis as possible. Coming to the renal abnormalities, there can be hypocalciuria, and due to failure of decreased filtered load, and because of the loss of the stimulatory effect of PTH on renal tubular calcium reabsorption, urinary calcium excretion is relatively high in patients with hypoparathyroidism and can actually, lead to renal stone formation if you replace that low calcium with a higher dose calcium. Frank hypercalciuria can occur as the serum calcium is raised towards normal. So once you are treating a case of hyperparathyroidism with oral calcium, you have to maintain it in the mid-normal range, not in the high normal range. So roughly around 8.5 is nearly a good optimum, target. Now, how do you evaluate a case of hypocalcemia and hypoparathyroidism? Measure the serum intact PTH. which is the most valuable test to perform. Other measurements include magnesium, creatinine, phosphate, vitamin D metabolites, alkaline phosphatase, check for amylase, urinary calcium excretion, because sometimes when there is a high calcium in the blood, all that calcium goes into the pancreas, causing pancreatitis. Then after that, you are actually facing hypocalcemia. So doing amylase level from that point of view will be helpful. Treatment is lifelong calcium and vitamin D supplementation. Goal is to relieve the symptoms and maintain the serum calcium between 8 to 8.5. Don't try to, raise it above normal range. Because if you raise it, then there can be hypercalcemia, calciuria, and that can lead to renal stone formation. So initially, you have to monitor the serum calcium and urinary calcium on the weekly basis. Once that is stabilized, and monitoring can be performed 3 to 6 months interval. Lastly, the advanced treatment of hypoparathyroidism is recombinant human PTH, which is not available in Pakistan. But this is a subcutaneous administration of this PTH hormone. FDA, that is for Food and Drug Authority in USA, approved it by the name of Netpara, and the trials have shown good results. That is all about today's lecture. I hope you could appreciate. And basically, the trial has shown that 42% of the Netpara treated patients achieved normal blood calcium levels on reduced doses of calcium. So basic aim of giving Netpara is to reduce the number of calcium and vitamin D supplements, because patients may be taking 8 and 10 tablets per day, which is too high and too bothersome for the patient. So I hope you understood the whole lecture. Thank you very much.